Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Well, Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna love my modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support for the show by going to iTunes and leaving an iTunes review or tweeting to @USModernist. Today, US Modernist Radio welcomes filmmaker Nathanial Kahn and architectural critic Alexandra Lange. And although Charlie Rose burst into tears at the very mention of their names, here are your hosts, George Smart and Frank King.
Thank you, Tom. And welcome to US Modernist Radio. I'm George Smart, and this is show 15. We've had some really wonderful guests so far, and today is certainly no exception. In fact, only 2 people have turned us down, and even then, not directly. Oh. It was through their agents.
Oh, well, that's somehow better.
Yes. These 2 people, Weird Al Yankovic and Ice Cube. Now, why, you ask, would US Modernist Radio want Weird Al and Ice Cube on a show about architecture? Well, it turns out that Weird Al was a design student before he started his parody musical career.
Really?
Perhaps he was using more of an architect name like W. Albert Yankovic or Yankovic and Partners.
Right.
And then Ice Cube did a great video on the Eames a few years ago that you can still find on YouTube. So if you're friends with Mr. Yankovic or Mr. Cube, please put in a good word for us. We'll be giving away prizes on US Modernist Radio, but you have to enter to win. And given our love of mid-century modern, the entry method is the postcard. Remember those?
Yeah.
Small pieces of cardstock, like a 3x5 index card, or maybe an old postcard sitting in your office drawer, that you write an address, put on a stamp, and then you take to an ancient temple called the post office. So write us at US Modernist Radio in care of Soundtracks, 302 Jefferson Street, Suite 160, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27605. And please, please cheat. Enter as many times as you want.
It's like voting in Chicago?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Go for it. Stack the deck, fiddle with the lotto balls. We would love to hear from you. And it's not like we're giving away cars or trips or anything. So get to writing. You might just get mentioned on the show like our #1 fan, the lovely and talented Consuela Marshall.
Ah, yes.
Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Greg Kelly of Modbox USA and Sarah Sonk of Moho Realty. Are you having a hard time finding or selling a modernist home? Sarah Sonk of Moho Realty is an agent who gets it like you do. She loves the modernist houses that you love with the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. www.mohorealty.com or 919-601-7339. And by modboxusa.com. Turn your mailbox into a modbox with one of Modbox USA's colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes that complements your home's modern aesthetic and turns mail time into
party time.
Yeah. See one now at modboxusa.com. And now here's Frank with Amara's News.
And now from the latest issue of Duh magazine comes my favorite headline of the year. Award-winning building constructed next to volcano. Wait for it. Destroyed by volcano. Who could see that coming? This visitor center on the Cape Verde island of Fogo, designed by Lisbon-based Auto Architectos took 7 years to complete. It was inaugurated last April, was named Cultural Building of the Year in Arch Daily's Building of the Year 2015 awards, and was then promptly destroyed by the volcano next door.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
I know. One of the architects said, "We think buildings are forever, but nature is stronger, volcanoes especially." Thank you, Captain Obvious. They apparently forgot the first rule of real estate, which is, of course, location, location, location. Over the past several years, there have been more and more tourist attractions opening which utilize glass to add the thrill factor to the experience, including the Tower Bridge in London and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, Hualapai Skywalk at the Grand Canyon. In other words, as you're walking across the skywalk, you can look down through the glass and see the Grand Canyon.
Right.
Add to that list in China a bridge that was recently completed with a glass walkway that is suspended 180 meters. Unless you're Lincoln Chafee, you don't know. It's 590 feet over a sheer drop. Its creators say that the bridge is perfectly safe. Perfectly safe? In China? This from a country famous for lead-painted toys, baby formula containing antifreeze, and an easy-bake oven that was practically a children's Chernobyl. Parents reported plugging that thing in and the lights in the house would go dim. And as a matter of fact, after the glass skywalk had only been open for a few weeks, guess what? Part of the flooring cracked. There was a loud noise, and some of the glass appeared to break up. The Chinese authorities said that the cracks had, and I'm quoting, "no impact on safety," end quote. Yeah, right. I'll drink to that. Pass me another shot of that baby formula. And finally, a new genre of super strong origami. It has been invented by these engineers. A trio of engineers describes an entirely new form of origami, yeah, that's the paper stuff, that they say turns a small piece of paper into a structure more than 2 orders of magnitude stronger than itself. Wow, twice as strong as paper. The quicker picker-upper. Origami engineering has really taken a leap forward in the last few years, says co-author Eugenio Filippo. He says that their system could change how we build spacecraft. Excuse me? Spacecraft made out of origami? If he believes making a spacecraft out of non-standard material is safe, I've got a glass bridge in China I can sell him. And that's the Modernist News.
Our guests today are Nathanial Kahn and Alexandra Lange. Nathanial is a director and producer and the son of celebrated architect Louis Kahn, one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, and landscape architect Harriet Pattison. In 2003, he produced the Oscar-nominated film My Architect, about the life and work of his dad, who died in 1974. Critics have called the film meaningful to anyone who seeks to understand the relationship between art and love. Louis Kahn was interested in creating modern buildings with the feel of ancient ruins, and using concrete, Kahn did that brilliantly with projects such as the Four Freedoms Park, the Phillips Exeter Library, the Salk Institute, and his most famous work, the National Assembly Building in Bangladesh. In My Architect, Nathanial captured on film his own journey to learn about his dad, the myth, the man, and the mostly absent father. He interviewed people who knew Louis Kahn, including Frank Gehry, Philip Johnson, and I.M. Pei, and visited his projects throughout the world. Alexandra Lange is a really wicked smart person about architecture. She's the architecture critic for Curbed and a columnist at Dezeen. She is a rising authority and prolific writer for print and digital publications like Architect, Dwell, Metropolis, New York Magazine, and the New York Times, among others. Previously a Loeb Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, she taught architecture criticism at New York University and is a leader in a new breed of digital curators, people who curate visually interesting exhibits you see on your screen, but not inside a brick-and-mortar gallery or museum. She is the author of Writing About Architecture, Mastering the Language of Buildings and Cities, about how to read and write architecture criticism, as well as the ebook, The Dot-Com City, Silicon Valley Urbanism, about the offices of Facebook, Google, and Apple. Nathanial and Alexandra, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Hey, Alexandra, here's an architectural criticism 101 question for you. What makes a building good architecturally? I know a lot of people fall back on the old, it's hard to say exactly, but I know it when I see it, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a standard for defining porn. But is there a better way than that?
Well, yeah, I think there is a better way. I know I personally always start just from the experience of walking into and through a building, the kind of the path and the flow and the way it connects to its environment are probably the first thing I always look at when I'm trying to write a review. And I think the material and style aspects of the building have to come after that. They're important, but it's really how a building speaks to its audience that gives you the first basis for writing criticism about it, or talking to your friends about it even.
If I wanted to be a better critic, what's something I could do differently when I walk into my next new building?
Well, let's see. I thought you were going to say what's one thing I could do differently when writing about it. But when walking into it,
yeah.
I think you should just try to be aware of all the surfaces. Are the steps easy to go up, or do they trip you up? What kind of material is beneath your feet? What's over your head? What's the lighting level like? Are there lots of signs in the middle of the hallway, which actually I think are usually a bad sign because the best architecture doesn't need signage?
Oh.
All of these things, just about how smooth it is to enter the building, to find what you need. That's the experience that a good architect will always try to shape. And so I think people just need to be more aware of what's around them in 3 dimensions, and not just follow the rat path and head to the elevator.
So it's kind of like Star Wars. You sort of have to use the Force and get the whole...
I don't think it's the Force. I think it's just being more observant. You mentioned me as kind of a visual curator, and I feel like, we criticize people for always having their smartphone in their hand, but I think for me, taking more photos and sharing them on Instagram with my phone has made me more aware of some details, some experiences, and given me a way to document it. And I think, for some people, a way to start being more observant is to take more pictures, not of themselves, not of their family, but maybe of buildings. There are lots of different ways into just being more aware of your environment. And once you're more aware, I think you become more critical. And you're like, well, why do I want to go into this store rather than that store? Or why do I hate renewing my driver's license so much? It's not just about the line process. It may also be about the low ceiling or the fluorescent lighting or something like that.
That's the next great architectural challenge, the DMV office.
Absolutely.
That really evokes respect and admiration in the design community. I hope that comes soon.
Yeah. Well, I'm always saying, I don't know if you both have shopped at Trader Joe's. The Trader Joe's has the best line management I've ever seen. And when I go to a museum whose lobby is just filled with people milling around and they don't know where to go and it's a mess, I'm just like, get the Trader Joe's people in here. Like, they have designed the line process.
So
they have expertise to share.
By line management, you mean like queues of people or visual lines?
Queues of people in a space. Where to put them, how to keep them moving.
Yeah.
Do you want 1 line? Do you want 4 lines? Can you see
right.
from the lobby where you need to go? From the entrance, you go through the revolving door. Where do you need to go? It's amazing to me that so many visual institutions like museums have not solved this problem better.
Nathanial, with what Alexandra shared with us, this idea of being sensitive to what's around you and the effect of the space on the observer, your dad was really a master at that. If you walk towards his buildings, even from quite a distance, you get that feeling, right?
Well, I'd kind of like to hear what Alexandra has to say about his buildings. I found her introduction completely fascinating, and the thing that I really love about it is, and fits right in with what I tried to do with the film, is that, for me, too much architectural criticism is highfalutin, heady stuff with lots of Foucault and things like that thrown in, which I have no idea what any of that really means anyway. But to me, it really should start with, what is your response to a building? How do you feel about it? And in going to make my film, because it was about my father and because the film is a journey to get to know him. He died when I was young, and for reasons that we can talk about later, maybe he didn't live with us, and so I had a fairly limited vision of him, although it was very intense, and he was a wonderful man. The film was a way to get to know him, and so that also fits in with what Alexandra was saying, because I went to get to know him with a camera, and a camera somehow slowed me down in a way. When looking at a building of his, and I would say to myself, what angle do I want to take this from? What am I responding to? What is it like to move through this building? What does it feel like? What's the emotion I'm getting from this place? And ultimately, that's very much what I take the audience. The journey that I take the audiences on during the film is a journey of discovery, my own journey of discovery. But it's very much an emotional journey, and I think that is the key to experiencing and enjoying any art. Is what is your personal response? And I remember being in college, and they'd say, well, it doesn't matter what you personally feel. What do you find in the text? What can you support with intellectual ideas? And of course, there is a place for that. But ultimately, in the end, what really matters, or certainly your starting place ought to be, how does a place make you feel? How does a piece of art make you feel? So with my father's buildings, they made me feel all kinds of things, and they're very complex. I think that's another thing that I'm sure, Alexandra, I would ask you about this. I think there is the utility of a building, of course. Does it work for what it's meant to do? Is it a good place to live? Is it a good place to work? Is it a good place to buy groceries? That's part of it. But then part of it also is what kind of the complexity of the place. Does it give you a mix of feelings? Does it change from day to day? Is it just one thing, or is it a structure, a thing that changes from day to day? And I certainly found in my father's architecture that if I'd go back on a rainy day or a sunny day, or a lonely day or a happy day, the building was giving me something emotionally different each time. So, very rich environment to make a film in. But I certainly agree with Alexandra's point, right off, that it's the emotional response to the space that is the beginning of everything.
Nathanial, how did your father come into public awareness? What kind of project did he put out there that really got him on the radar?
Well, at some point in his career, he would have been very happy to do a Department of Motor Vehicles building. He was always looking for a good commission. I think architects always are. It's a hard profession. It always has been. You got to get the job. And as Robert Venturi said when asked the question of, what makes a good architect, or what's the main thing, what's the main advice you would give to a young architect? His advice was, get the job. And so certainly getting the job was something that my father took him a long time to get jobs that actually were sort of things that allowed him to fully express himself. He did houses for a long time. He did a lot of studies about Philadelphia, trying to make the city a better place. And as an architect, he felt very, very strongly that the architect had a social and really spiritual responsibility to make the world better for people. And he spent many years trying to transform the city of Philadelphia, make it a better place. Most of those projects, well, in fact, pretty much all of them, did not go through. And I deal with that in the film and the frustrations of that, and sometimes they're quite even humorous. But he persisted, and ultimately, at the age of about 51, he got a commission that really was transformative, and that was the Yale Art Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut. And that was a building that fully really allowed him. He was ready for it. Architects, many times it takes a long time. It takes many decades to get really good at it. It's a very, very difficult art. There's so many things to master. But at 51, he got a commission that really gave him a chance to fully express himself. And from there on, for the next 20 years, he did remarkable buildings, and no two alike. Each one is different from the other. Actually, Alexandra, I'd love to ask you about that. What do you think of Louis Kahn's architecture? I'd love to know what you have to say about it.
Well, I'm a big fan. I think most contemporary architecture critics probably are. And I have to say, it's so interesting you just brought up the Yale University Art Gallery, because I went to Yale as an undergrad, so that is probably the first Kahn building I ever went into in my early art history courses, because Yale has a terrific art collection as well. And I think there's something. I think it would be interesting to talk to a lot of critics about what were the first kind of important works of architecture they encountered when they were old enough and aware enough to think about them. Because for me, I went to Yale, so the art gallery and the British Art Center, along with Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building, were probably the works of modern architecture that I spent the most time in, at the same time as I started to take my first architecture history classes. So those buildings are really meaningful to me also, kind of at a young person's emotional level. And I feel lucky that I got to encounter them in a way before I had all of the intellectual rubric that I have now. I mean, I like to bring both of those aspects to buildings. I mean, to know the history and to understand the larger context, but also to preserve that kind of innocent encounter with the architecture is really important, because that, again, gets to the emotional core. And I love the Yale Art Gallery. I mean, I love it as a building on a campus that doesn't call attention to itself necessarily, but works really well. It was, the interior was refreshed and reorganized a few years ago, I thought, very beautifully, so that the Kahn building works the way it was supposed to originally, with these big open plan floors that have a kind of triangle waffle ceiling, and then it's next door to this neo-Gothic building, and that also works well. So I think the cleverness with which he fit himself into a campus that already had these buildings, that had strong architecture, and then gave the gallery a really distinctive architecture of its own is just, kind of a lesson to all architects. And then the British Art Center, which is right across the street, is a later building that I think, announces itself a little more strongly, but also is just a beautiful setting for art and has a beautifully proportioned atrium, and the materials are all lovely. And you mentioned, going to his buildings at different times of day. I think the metal panels on the outside of the British Art Center, look different in different kinds of light, and just the awareness of that and thinking about materials that kind of, take the light, take the rain is so important.
You're absolutely right. It's funny, he had a hard time selling the metal exterior to the then president of Yale. Yeah, and the way that he was also a master salesman, even though in many ways my father was a little impractical. Certainly when it came down to it, he could sling it with the best of them. And he said, "Oh, come on, this metal's going to be beautiful on a sunny day. It will be a butterfly. On a rainy day, it will be a moth." Yeah. So anyway, apparently that was enough to sell the outside idea, which really hadn't been done before. It's stainless steel that's unfinished. It's quite lovely. I went to Yale too, actually, and so my first experience was very much, really my first experience with being close to my dad's buildings, what was at Yale, and the British Art Center. I always gravitated towards it. I sort of preferred it, actually, but when I went back to make the film, I found something about the Yale Art Gallery, and it's kind of interesting to have an architect who builds their sort of first major building right across the street from their last major building, and they're separated by about 20 years, and British Art Center was the last building that was finished. It was finished just after he died, and the building in Bangladesh was finished yet later, but the last commission that was fully finished in his lifetime, nearly, was the British Art Center. But when I went to make the film, I found in the Yale Art Gallery something that was so remarkable to me, and it was sort of continued to inspire me as I go along making other films. And that's that. I'm sure you know, Alexandra, you know the building well, but for those people who haven't been there, it's kind of a building that's sort of doing two things at once. Part of it is pretty, I wouldn't call it, nothing about it is standard modernism, but it was kind of a lot of what was going on at the time. There is a big wall of glass. There's kind of an almost severe brick wall, and it looks a little like a modernist box. In fact, Tom Wolfe, the critic at the time, once called it looked like a Wilco department store. So it maybe doesn't look like that much from the outside. And then inside, it has these, as Alexandra described, these remarkable triangular ceilings, triangular formed ceilings, but also there is within it this incredible staircase that is like something that feels like it's right out of the ancient world. And he had just come back when he was designing the building. He had just come back from a trip to the ancient world for the first time, when he really saw the pyramids of Egypt and the temples in Greece, and spent time in Rome. And he was really taken with this idea that what modern architecture needed was an injection of the power of ancient ruins, the kind of timeless quality, the thing that makes you feel like, you know, you're part of the great sweep of history. So he wanted to do that, but with modern buildings. And so in his first commission, the building is sort of two things. There's almost a tentativeness to it. There's this sense that I want to be modern, so here's the modern part of my building, but I also want to be ancient, and here's the ancient part of my building. And so I love that building for its sense of sudden inspiration. It's also tentativeness. He's trying something that's really new, and he's trying to put two things together, and he achieves it. It has a kind of, there's almost an uneasiness to it. And in future buildings, he was able to sort of fully embrace and integrate the ancient qualities, the timeless qualities of architecture that he loved in the ancient world. But that first sort of major building has the sense of discovery, but also almost a slightly tentative quality to it that I personally love. And of course, you know, those of us who mature late in life, it makes you feel better to know that your father took till he was in his 50s to really find his stride.
And he was a well-known and appreciated professor as well as being an architect.
That's true. He was. Teaching was very important to him. And I mean, Alexandra, do you teach, right?
Yes, I'm not teaching at the moment, but I do teach often.
Don't you find that sort of in the atmosphere of teaching, that having to define your ideas to really smart young people kind of keeps you on your game and makes you think better?
Well, it definitely makes you boil things down. I mean, I found with teaching that I always feel like I'm repeating everything 3 times, but that is, in fact, how often you have to say things, even to very smart young people, for it to sink in. I mean, it's something about the pedagogy that the first time they can't really hear it. And it just makes you then also, boil your thoughts down about, how to write better, what story structure should you use, all of that, because you have to say it out loud, you have to explain it. And so, I felt like the first couple of times I taught my class on writing architecture criticism, it was okay, but not great. But by the 3rd or 4th time, I knew better, how to get from point A to point B and how to bring those students along with me so that they were really, really improving their writing. They understood how to do it. And by the end of the class, they wrote some great things.
Well, maybe what you needed, Alexandra, was some very interesting sound bites to grab the students' attention. For instance, Louis Kahn was famous for his Zen-like statements that he would make during class. Here's one: to hear a sound is to see a space. And another one: a great building must begin with the unmeasurable, must go through measurable means when it is being designed, and in the end must be unmeasurable. I have, in my mind, is going through, early episodes of Kung Fu with David Carradine reciting these from Master Po. And of course, his most famous one is about a brick, which I want to read for you. Louis Kahn's famous paragraph about a brick. If you think of brick, that's brick with a capital B, you say to brick, "What do you want, brick?" And brick says to you, "I like an arch." And if you say to brick, look, arches are expensive and I can use a concrete lintel over you. What do you think of that, brick? And brick says, I like an arch.
You guys have no idea the grief that I took as a young person with the kids of architects who were in my class who would tease me about my father who listened to brick walls. It was no fun, let's put it that way.
Yes, but the point he was trying to make, of course, was that you are evoking an experience from the materials to help shape what we talked about in the top of the show about how people experience a building.
Right, and that materials have a form that they more naturally want to take, or that it's easier to assemble them into. And you shouldn't take shortcuts, and you shouldn't try to make bricks do, something wholly artificial that probably requires extra interior and hidden structure. But I feel like those quotes were also read out loud to me in my architecture classes, and then everyone snickers. And it's not a good teaching moment because people laugh and then they don't take the time to try to figure out what was going on. I do have to. It's so interesting to me. I've read a lot of things about Kahn, and I've read the statements, and people always talk about how charming he was and what a good teacher, and sometimes I feel like that must have just been something that you had to experience, because I don't think it necessarily comes across so well on the page. Or I don't know, maybe Nathaniel, you can speak to this, that there are some kinds of personalities that you do have to encounter in person to understand how it works, like how he interacted with clients, how he convinced them to do what he wanted.
I think that's right. To some degree, it was something where you had to be there. However, I do think some of his writing and some of the transcriptions of his speeches are really quite wonderful if you get into them and especially if you listen to them, and many of them are recorded. Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting when you were describing teaching. You were talking about sort of. It sounds like you have a rather you have a prescription that you want to impart to people, or you have a specific set of things you want to impart. And I that makes perfect sense to me. I love that. I think that my father's reason for teaching was somewhat different. And I think maybe that's the piece that you can't get from just reading his words. And that's that he really was trying to figure it out on the spot. And being put on the spot and having to speak and having to say something actually made him come up with things that then he kind of listened to himself say it, and sort of like improvising something. And he played the piano, so he would improvise on the piano as well. And it's the kind of thing where you do something and then you listen to it and you say, hey, that's not half bad. I want to remember that. And you wouldn't have come up with that if you had written it down beforehand, decided what you were going to say, or had a syllabus. So his teaching method was definitely. This is another comment of his, which I actually deeply admire. Just as an honest teacher, he said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, that as a teacher, I really have no hopes for any particular student whatsoever. I only hope that in the atmosphere of teaching myself, something rubs off on them, and that will be useful. And I think I don't know. That's I have to say I think the old man was right. It's kind of swell.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that, first of all, I think as a writer, you are used to planning things out in advance. And
sure.
So, in fact, live speech is terrifying, or live and unplanned speech is terrifying. I also I feel like maybe I'm a pragmatic person. I would hate to think that a student wouldn't get something out of my class. I always... sometimes people
right.
tell me, "Oh, you know how much your class costs," and I'm like, "Oh my God, that's frightening to me, especially given how much they're paying me to teach this class." But I would hate to think that a student, would spend a semester with me and not get something out of it, and so I try to make sure they definitely get something out of it. And I also feel, I also feel, and I think this is actually at the base of a lot of architectural education, that if you learn some simple rules, then you can have freedom. And I feel like a lot of writing works like that too. So I try to teach my students a very simple, basically, 5-paragraph essay structure because I say if you learn this, you can write about almost anything. You can convince people of almost anything if you just understand kind of how to lay out your argument. So I think it's prescriptive, but only in trying to give them like a kind of stage one tool that then they can take in their own direction and fill with their own content.
Okay, Nathaniel, you followed up My Architect with The Buried Secret of M. Night Shyamalan.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find the secret, or is this just like Geraldo Rivera rooting around in Al Capone's vault?
Oh no. That's a much longer story for a different day. But it was a lot of fun, and Knight's a great guy and a very talented filmmaker. I also followed it up with a film called Two Hands about
Yes.
a pianist named Leon Fleischer. That film was also nominated for an Oscar. I'm interested in the lives of artists. I think artists are fascinating subjects. I like people who are on the edge and who are out there and who don't do things in the usual sort of way. I'm inspired by people like that.
What's next? Is there a My Architect 2 or The Wrath of Kahn 2?
Goodness, no.
Or something more current like
Absolutely not.
Calatrava Gone Wild?
No, that's architecture again. I'm actually making a film about a fantastic telescope called the James Webb Space Telescope, and working with NASA and the people who are building the telescope, which is absolutely fascinating. And in many ways, it is like watching people building the first Gothic cathedral. It's something that's never been done before. It has all this incredible technology that that has never been tried and never been put together before, but it's aimed at seeing the beginning of time and aimed at trying to figure out if we're alone in the universe. So, it's the big questions, and it's a thrilling project to observe and be part of, and in many ways it reminds me of making a film about an architect or architecture, because I think that the architects who I really admire are ones who try things that have never been tried before, who want to take risks. And it may be old problems, but they're finding new solutions to those old problems, or old challenges and finding new solutions to it. So I think, these are the sorts of things that interest me in my, in my work.
Alexandra, one of the things that strikes me about you is how you have really become part of a new breed of critic, curator. You have your finger literally on the keypad of architecture. You're on Instagram. You're on various platforms. Your articles are coming out, almost every other week on these different things. One project that you were involved in was called the Meta Museum, which was an experiment in sort of collective online curation by 13 American museums and cultural institutions, where every week a work chosen by different people at each location was presented on Tumblr and through other social media outlets. That's a fantastic new distribution model for exhibits. How did that work?
That was a really fun project that I came up with basically on my own as part of an outreach program by the Museum of Arts and Design here in New York. They asked a bunch of people to contribute ideas to a kind of floating museum. And that was my idea because I've always felt like there needed to be more connections between different museums and their collections. I mean, museums tend to have kind of straight-ahead PR, like this is our show, and it's only, journalists who say, okay, well, you have this show about Brazilian modernism, and they're having that show about Mexican modernism, and there are these other things, connections in a city or across the country. And sometimes museums themselves don't make those connections that I think are really helpful for people interested in these topics. So my idea for the Meta Museum was to ask museums from across the country with design collections to send me items from their collections. These are things that are probably not on view that often, based around a set of different themes. And I tried to pick themes that you could read in different ways. So one was alphabet, one was eat, one was children. So you could see things from different design disciplines fitting that. I mean, you could have had a drawing for a restaurant. You could have had, modernist tableware. You could have had a really beautiful 18th century fork. And those would all be presented in the same week on Tumblr, kind of in a line. So it almost made its own themed design exhibit every week. And so that just ran for about 3 months on the Tumblr, and you can still go to the Tumblr. I mean, that's a great thing in a way about digital things. They last forever as long as, Tumblr doesn't go out of business. But now it's interesting. Just last week I saw that a bunch of different museums in London were doing a co-curated Instagram project where somebody from, say, the Victoria and Albert Museum was going to the Museum of Natural History in London and taking photos and making connections between their two collections. And this was happening all across the city. And I tweeted about it. I said, hey, we should do this in New York. And immediately, 5 or 6 people that I know in museums tweeted back, like, we're on it, don't worry. So I think there's going to be a project like that in New York very soon. And somebody else I know who works for a museum in Boston said, oh, we should do this too. So I think Tumblr is just one platform. Instagram is another platform for museums to really get together and say we can all appreciate each other's collections. We're not in competition. In fact, our viewers are all the same people, and it's great if we can make conversations, outside the museum walls.
And besides curating, I notice you're also really good at headlines. I don't know if this is you or your editor, but here are a couple of the headlines from your articles. Never loved buildings, rarely stand a chance. A moat, a ditch, how to secure the White House grounds.
Ha! Okay.
Women were unwelcome in architecture, but male architects couldn't live without them. And my favorite, which I wanted to ask you about, was 7 leading architects defend the world's most hated buildings.
Mm-hmm.
So we lost one of those recently, right?
Yes, we did, actually. I wrote 2 of those headlines. The editors wrote the others.
Okay.
And the editors at the New York Times wrote the most hated buildings. That story was in T magazine for the New York Times, and it was, I have to say, to me, surprisingly popular. People really loved the rubric, and basically I did interviews with a number of leading architects, including Daniel Libeskind, Annabelle Seldorf, Zaha Hadid, about hated buildings that they loved and wanted to defend. And Zaha Hadid spoke about Paul Rudolph's Orange County Government Center in Goshen, New York, which is indeed in the process of being demolished right now. It's
a terrible loss. That's just a terrible thing. It's an amazing building.
Yeah, it is. It is. I visited at least the outside last year when I was upstate. A number of architectural photographers did projects documenting it. It's clear that while it may have leaked, it had many excellent points, and somebody sympathetic could have made something really wonderful about it, and that just didn't happen.
What was your feeling walking into that building? What you started talking in the beginning of this interview. You started talking about your first reaction is what you're looking for. What was your feeling when you walked in that building?
I thought it was incredibly elegant and surprising, because as often happens with famous buildings, you keep seeing the same photograph of them over and over. And this is, again, to the point of more people taking photographs, more people being observant. And so there's this one side of Orange County Government Center with many, many windows, sort of owlish windows, and so it's shot taken from the parking lot. But in fact, the building was kind of U-shaped and had this interior courtyard that you could access from the front by a ramp or from the back, kind of in a slot between buildings. So when you actually were going to enter the building, you actually entered it through this courtyard that was very green and beautiful and almost a little bit Japanese, which is totally unexpected, especially given the kind of brutalist tag for the building. So you would have had this little kind of moment in this garden, and then you would go inside, and there's kind of a narrow door, and then you would go into this large hall with stairs. Rudolph really liked kind of level changes and stairs that was lit from above, and then that was supposed to direct you to the different the different functions that were all housed within Government Center. So really, there was this much more elaborate sequence of entry than most people realized because they were used to experiencing it through 2 or 3 photos. And also over the years, it got shabby, it got dark, various things happened. And so again, if you only think about the building in its current state as it's currently being used, maybe it wasn't so immediately appealing, but architects and other people who know the roots of it or can kind of look at the structure of it without the accretions of time would be able to figure out how to make it work for contemporary government.
Yeah, we kind of get to the point of architecture, like other arts, really should be preserved when you have an amazing work of architecture, even if it isn't totally useful anymore in the way that it was originally designed for. It doesn't mean you should throw it away, tear it down, do something different. I think that this is also something you've talked about in your work, the idea of needing to think of architecture as art that should be kept. It's part of our cultural, it's part of it's our heritage, right? It's something that's an important part of what makes us who we are, just like paintings or sculpture or forks or any other kind of art, right?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's going to be, very sad in about 20 years when I think more people are going to understand the concrete architecture of the 1960s and 70s to realize how many examples of it have been destroyed in the interim. I will say, sometimes buildings are no longer appropriate for their original uses, but I think it's really important, and if they're good buildings, it's almost always possible to come up with new uses for them. I don't really believe in museum buildings, buildings just for the sake of themselves, except in rare cases, because I feel like that is just a recipe for kind of declining admissions and things wearing out. But something like the TWA terminal at JFK, Aero Saarinen's iconic building, they've been trying to come up with a new use for it for some time, and the longer it sits there with nothing happening in it, the more nervous I get.
And I believe it's going to be a hotel now. They've decided.
Yeah, they've been talking about making it into a hotel, though, the hotel rooms would actually be in a separate structure, but it's just taken so long to get to that point of there actually being a project and a plan.
On the website, we will have a complete list of Paul Rudolph houses and also all the Louis Kahn houses, as well as biographies on both of these gentlemen. And I want to thank our guests today, Nathanial Kahn, Alexandra Lange. Both of you, please come back on the show with us.
Great, thank you.
It'll be my pleasure.
US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. And by modboxusa.com and their swanky, colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes. Thanks for listening. I'm George Smart with Frank King. Take us home, Tom.
Visit US Modernist Radio on the web at usmodernistradio.org for links about the people and buildings mentioned today on the show. We record at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Meanwhile, follow us on Twitter at US Modernist or email us at comments@usmodernistradio.org. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another undercover, encrypted, hidden in plain sight, on the down low edition of US Modernist Radio.